Did you know that on August 15, 1971, a quiet television address from the President of the United States ended a system that had defined the meaning of money for over a century? That night, without a single gun fired or vote cast, civilization's relationship with value itself changed. Until that moment, every US dollar carried a silent promise that it could be exchanged for real gold. That promise was the foundation of trust. It linked paper money to something tangible, something rare, something human beings had worshipped for millennia. But in a single evening, that link was cut. Money was no longer backed by anything but faith. To understand why this happened, we have to step back to the age when gold was more than metal. For thousands of years, gold was seen as the perfect form of money. It didn't rust, it didn't rot, and it couldn't be printed. If you owned gold, you owned something that had real weight, something that every culture on Earth agreed was valuable. Empires measured their power in gold reserves. Kings built entire economies around it. And for centuries, if you wanted to trade, you used coins made of real gold or silver. But carrying gold was risky. It was heavy, hard to transport, and easy to steal. So as trade expanded, banks and governments found a new idea: paper notes. These were simpler to use, and each note represented a promise. You could always go to the bank and exchange that paper for actual gold. That was the beginning of the gold standard, a global agreement that every piece of paper money must be backed by a fixed amount of gold sitting safely in a vault. So if your government said $1 equals a certain weight of gold, you could actually redeem it. It was like having a receipt for something real. This created trust. People knew their money wasn't just paper, it was a claim to something valuable. Section 2. How it worked. Here's how it worked in practice. Let's say you had a $20 bill. Under the gold standard, that bill was worth about 1 ounce of gold. You could walk into a bank, hand over your $20 and receive that gold. That was the rule, a promise every government made to its people and to the world. This system also tied the hands of governments. They couldn't just print more money whenever they wanted. For every new dollar, they had to add an equal amount of gold to their reserves. That discipline kept economies stable. Prices didn't rise quickly. Inflation was low and savings held their value for decades. International trade was simpler too, because currencies were all linked to gold. Their exchange rates were fixed. It was a world where money had meaning and limits. But gold had one big problem. It didn't grow with the economy. The amount of gold in the world increased slowly, but economies were expanding rapidly. New factories, new jobs, new technology. That meant sometimes there wasn't enough money in circulation to support all the trade and growth happening. And when that happened, economies slowed down or even collapsed. The first real cracks appeared during World War I. Governments needed to pay for massive armies, weapons, and supplies, but they didn't have enough gold to back the money they were spending. So they did the only thing they could. They printed money anyway. When the war ended, countries tried to return to the gold standard, but it didn't fit the new reality. Prices had soared, debts were enormous, and the gold reserves no longer matched the amount of paper in circulation. The system was breaking under its own weight. Then came the Great Depression. Economies crashed, unemployment soared, and people lost faith in banks. In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took a drastic step in 1933. He made it illegal for ordinary citizens to own gold. Everyone had to sell their gold to the government at $20.67 per ounce. Once he had collected it, he raised the official price of gold to $35. That instantly devalued the dollar, but it gave the government more control over money. The gold standard still existed internationally, but inside the US it was now mostly symbolic. After World War II, the world was in ruins. Nations needed stability to rebuild, and they turned again to gold, but this time with a twist. In 1944, 44 countries met at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. They decided that instead of tying every currency directly to gold, they would tie all of them to the US dollar, and the dollar would remain tied to gold. This meant that the US dollar became the backbone of the global economy. If you trusted America, you trusted the dollar, and through it, the entire system. And since the United States held more than half the world's gold after the war, the trust seemed well placed. For nearly 2 decades, the system worked beautifully. The 1950s and 60s saw enormous growth, low inflation, and rising prosperity. But beneath the surface, trouble was quietly growing. By the 1960s, the US was spending heavily on the Vietnam War, on domestic programs, and on global influence during the Cold War. But the government was printing far more money than it had in gold reserves. Foreign countries started to notice that the math didn't add up. They realized there were far more dollars in the world than America had gold to redeem. France, led by President Charles de Gaulle, demanded real gold in exchange for US dollars. French warships arrived in New York to collect it. Billions in gold left America's vaults. Confidence in the dollar began to crumble. By 1971, the US faced a dilemma: defend the dollar and lose its gold, or abandon the gold standard and save the economy. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. His message was calm, but historic. He announced that the United States would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. Temporarily, he said, but that temporary suspension became permanent. Overnight, the world's financial foundation shifted. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. The gold standard, gone. Money was now backed by nothing but government decree. The new system was called fiat currency, from the Latin word meaning "let it be done." In other words, money now had value simply because the government said so. Other countries followed quickly because their currencies were linked to the dollar. Britain, Japan, Germany all had to adapt. The gold standard disappeared worldwide. This new freedom allowed governments to print money whenever necessary. It made economic crises easier to manage in the short term. But it also removed the natural brakes that gold had imposed. Without gold's limits, inflation became easier, and debt became normal. Governments could borrow and spend endlessly, confident that they could always create more money if needed. At first, the change felt liberating. Economies grew, global trade exploded. Credit expanded faster than ever. Nations built roads, industries, and empires of finance, all powered by paper promises. It was the age of confidence, of consumption, of endless possibility. But over time, the price became clear. A dollar that once represented a fixed amount of gold now represented only trust, and trust is fragile. Inflation rose, prices climbed, savings lost their power. The quiet tax of devaluation began eating away at ordinary lives. Since the 1970s, the cost of living has multiplied many times over. The dollar buys only a fraction of what it once did. National debts have ballooned into the trillions. Financial crises, once rare, have become routine, arriving in waves: 1987, 2000, 2008, 2020. Each one different, yet all sharing the same root: money unmoored from reality. The gold standard's discipline was gone, replaced by a new kind of instability, the kind that comes from unlimited money and limited restraint. And the ripple effects reached every corner of the planet. Europe built the euro on the same fiat foundation, hoping shared belief could replace shared gold. Japan, once booming, spent decades wrestling with deflation, the hangover of easy credit and fading confidence. Across the developing world, nations borrowed in dollars only to find themselves trapped, paying back debts in a currency whose value they could never control. Even central banks, those modern temples of finance, began quietly buying gold again, as if somewhere deep down they still remembered, trust alone doesn't glitter. Today, the United States still holds the largest gold reserve on Earth, over 8,100 metric tons. It's more than Germany, Italy, France, and Russia combined. Most of it lies in underground vaults at Fort Knox, Denver, and West Point, a quiet reminder of a promise long broken. If the world were to return to the gold standard today, every US dollar in existence would need a tiny fraction of that gold behind it. But here's the problem. There are over $20 trillion in circulation and deposits worldwide, and at current prices, America's entire gold hoard wouldn't even cover a few percent. To back every dollar again, gold would need to rise not to $2,000, but closer to $50,000 per ounce. That's how far we've drifted from the anchor that once kept money real. And that's why returning to gold isn't just unlikely. It's almost impossible. The world has built its entire modern system on credit, leverage, and digital promises. Gold would demand honesty, and honesty has become too expensive. Today, every time prices rise, every time your savings seem to shrink, you're feeling the echo of that night in 1971 when money became infinite. That moment turned economics into politics, and politics into economics. It blurred the line between what nations could afford and what they could simply print. 50 years later, we no longer measure wealth by weight, but by belief. Paper, pixels, and promises. That's what we trade, that's what we trust. But maybe the lesson of 1971 isn't about gold at all. It's about discipline, and what happens when a world decides it can live without it. Because once money is free, nothing else truly is.